is Discord so I can have a look at the next question that we had. Um, so, Gavin Barnard, I don't know if you're in the chat at the moment, but he usually exports an STL. That's what he does for 3D printing, and then yes. So one of the issues with an STL is I believe that whilst you will have your geometric data coming across, you won't have any animations, you won't have any materials or textures. It specifically doesn't have those in there. I might be wrong, but I don't think I am in that particular case. So I wouldn't use an STL. I'd probably use a GLTF to begin with. OBJ might work. It's a bit of an archaic format now, but it is very simple as well. So
It is.
it does have that going for it.
I
So if
I mean,
you
really,
do,
my only problem with OBJ is we've been trying to use it for years. I mean, people have been trying to use it for years for things it was never designed to do.
Mhm.
So it falls short.
One of the issues with an OBJ, of course, is everything is centered around the origin if you export it. So if you need a bit of your model offset deliberately, a door, for instance, it ends up
Yeah.
being recentered around the object itself, which isn't great if you need pivot points and things like that, because then you've got to try and manually align it later. Um, oh, great one from Pacost. What is your preferred method for retopology? Is it using an external tool or the built-in remesh modifier? Neither. So, retopology, for those who don't know, is where you take something, often when you've sculpted something and the geometry is all messy. You've used tools. In fact, we could probably go ahead and do a bit of a live one on that. So let's switch over to the main screen again. So let's get rid of some of these extra bits around here. So if you've done some sculpting or something along those lines, and you may want to, well, there's no geometry at the moment. So one of the things that I think Pakosh is saying there is remeshing. Is it Control and R? I think it is. Yeah. I don't know what the settings are for it at the moment, but you can remesh to a certain size and you can start modeling and then you can remesh again, which is great if you've got, I think it's this tool here. Is this the hook? Elastic deform snake hook. That's the one I want. So then you can pull things out. And the problem when you pull things out like this is you end up stretching the geometry and then remeshing again, Control and R can help smooth that lot out and add in additional geometry. But when you do this, you end up with, well, I've created a bit of a mess there because I really went for it. But you end up with uneven geometry. Now, whilst this, I think, if you do the remesh and we have a look in edit mode at it, do we have quads? Does it actually do quads everywhere? It looks like it might have uh, made the whole mesh quads. But what it won't have done is done anything along the lines of making sure you've got edge loops running around your model, so or face loops for that matter. So if we go into face select, hold down Alt and click on one of these edges, you can see here it has a face loop running around like so. But the problem with that is you probably don't want it running around there. That's not defining the shape. You'd probably want it sort of coming up and around here and then probably looping back round here. So maybe joining up along here. So retopology would be taking this mesh here and remaking that mesh, retopologizing it in terms of making sure that edge loops and face loops. And this is really important more so if you're going to deform your mesh, either through animation or shape keys or anything along those lines. Because if you start doing it and your supporting loops are in the wrong place, you'll get artifacting, you'll get creasing in the wrong place. It'll be really difficult to work around it because the topology, the way that your mesh is laid out, is not supporting what you're trying to do with it. Now, if this was an amazing sculpture that you were just rendering out, retopologizing is probably something you don't want to do. That's one of the things with retopologizing and mesh in general. If you've got a model and you're not going to do any animation with it or anything along those lines, and it looks good, retopologizing for the sake of doing it really isn't worth doing it. If you needed a really clean model because you wanted it in your portfolio, that's something different. But knowing how to manage your time and not doing something like retopologizing when it doesn't need it is probably the way to go when it comes to that. Um,
BB Game Dev has added that if it needs to be animated, then do retopoloflow and do it manually.
Yes. Nothing beats doing it manually. It almost sort of balances out for me, very similar to um, how you'd have your UV unwrapping. At any point, you can smart UV unwrap a model, and for literally 90% of your work, that's probably fine. But that manual, I wouldn't go about doing manual unwrapping all the time unless there was a specific reason for it, because at that point, you're spending a lot of time on the unwrap, and whilst that can make your model look much better, it can also be a complete waste of time depending on what you're doing at the time. Now, if you were doing something that required more detail, more fidelity to it, and where you couldn't hide seams behind other bits of geometry, or if you're working with a team that expects a certain type of UV unwrap. So if you're working with a either just a partner or even yourself, if you're taking that model out of Blender into a third party program, or even in Blender, if you're just doing some texture painting, what you've got to bear in mind is if your UV unwrap makes no sense, then it's going to be incredibly difficult to paint on the UV unwrap. You can still paint on the model, but actually the UV unwrap itself will be unintelligible. It will make no sense whatsoever. And there is a particular issue that you will have if you don't have margins set up properly, where you paint on this side and it starts appearing on another bit of your model, and that can just ruin your model entirely if you go for that.
Would you like the next question?
Oh
Is it
yeah, yeah.
okay that I could go to Discord and read these? Since I'm just sitting here looking pretty.
Ah, yes.
Uh,
What's the
we
next
have another
question?
question from Jenny. Jenny asks, "How's the Python programming coming along with Blender? Have you learned a lot to teach a course in it?"
That's a very good question. That's actually the next one on the Discord as well. So, yes, I've been playing around a lot with
I was
Python.
reading the Discord.
Ah, that's why. That's why. So, when it comes to Python in Blender, I have I've gone through so much now, and I'm ready to teach a beginner's course with it. There's other stuff I need to get out of the way first, but that is incoming, and I also want to do an intermediate one, probably focused on add-on creation. And there'll be more news about that when it's not just a concept at the moment. There's not really a learning journey with it. But what I have done when it comes through making Python, I've done lots of. If you've taken any of the Blender courses so far, all the way going back to Godot Getaway, using Python to enhance yourself, to augment yourself. One of the great things that you can do with Python is if you've got a series of assets that you need to recenter in your scene and export each one individually and then reset your scene back up, you can do that by clicking one button. And there's always a balance to be had. And this is true whether it's geometry nodes where it takes maybe a whole day to set up a geometry node setup in order to make a simple model, but now you can make 500 different of them as per the weapons course that we released recently. That uses geometry nodes to create an infinite number, or not an infinite number, but whatever it is to the power of n variations when you give it, for instance, a sword with the pommel, the handle, and the blade
Blade.
itself. Yep. And so using either geometry nodes, or I could have done Python with that. In fact, we use a bit of Python in it because once we've gone through and we've made all of those models, we need to export them.
Mm.
And that's not part of the geometry nodes workflow. So then we switch over to doing some Python in Blender itself, and then being able to export all of those models in one click. In fact, then you can automate Blender. And I think that's what the key is for anybody getting into or wants to know, why would I even want to do any coding when I'm making models? But being able to automate part of your workflow is, I mean, it's just saves you so much
Right.
time.
The idea is not use Python to create a 3D mesh because that's kind of what the interface for Blender is for. You're not
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
replacing
yeah.
the interface. It's for all those things that the interface isn't able to do that you know the program can do, but it's not.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I want to sort of air here at the moment is that if anybody has any sort of questions when it comes to Python or things that they want to be able to do automatically in Blender, but they're struggling at the moment, then do shout out, because that may actually inspire a either a YouTube video or an entry into a course specifically on how to do that type of workflow.